I'll tell you, the fickle finger of fate has certainly been in the locker rooms and on the court for the Indiana Pacers this year. They have had so much adversity that they've had to overcome. And it's gone, and the record speaks for itself. They've gone from NBA finalists to a 2-14 record so far, but that doesn't mean they're poorly coached or that the team isn't playing hard. They are, and they are. And to discuss this is our friend Pat Boylan, who is the radio play-by-play voice for both the Indiana Pacers and the Indiana Fever, and he joins us today. Pat, it is great to have you back on the show.
Good to be back with you, Paul.
And, it's 2-14, far cry from the, being in the NBA Finals. But, I mean, when you talk about circumstances that are outside of your control, of course, there's the terrible injury to Tyrese Halliburton that really took any chance out of the Indiana Pacers being able to compete with OKC in the finals, even though they fought admirably. But without Halliburton being at his best, that was almost an impossible task. But now the injuries that your team has suffered, along with the departure of Miles Turner, you guys have just had a lot of adversity in Indianapolis, haven't you?
Paul, it just kind of felt like the first 6 or so months of the calendar year 2025, nothing could go wrong. I mean, Tyrese Halliburton is living this charmed basketball life where he's hitting the 4 different clutch shots in the playoffs, really unlike anything that has ever been seen, I think, in NBA history. The Pacers are, of course, a good team, but they're a 4 seed, and we know in the NBA that 4 seeds maybe win a playoff series, too, if they get really hot, but rarely come to Game 7 of the NBA Finals. It just seemed like they could do no wrong, and then it almost feels like that horrific injury you're referencing, which was the Achilles tear in Game 7, which really took their chances away of winning a championship. Everything that went right for 6 months straight, it feels like everything has gone wrong for maybe not 6 months since then, because there was a little bit of an off season for the Pacers in there, but really ever since things picked back up. You went into this season knowing that you're going to be without your best player, that's going to be really challenging in a sport like basketball and in a league like the NBA that's star-driven. You have to be realistic about what that means. But at the same time, the Pacers accomplished what they accomplished last year in large part because of their depth, in large part because of how good they were 1 through 10. And so I was still quite optimistic that this was going to be a team that was going to push for a playoff spot. It wouldn't have shocked me if they stayed healthy in the early portion of the season, if they were, pushing that 4 seed again. Andrew Nembhard is a Canadian and a terrific point guard, and the Pacers have known that for a long time, and unfortunately the circumstances have just been the opposite. They just went through a rash of injuries to nearly every significant player, really besides Pascal Siakam in the early portion of the season here. Nembhard went down, I think, in the second quarter of opening night. It was Canadian on Canadian friendly fire there. He got caught up in a locked arm situation with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, and that just kind of was the domino of what was a ton of injuries early on. They seem to be maybe stabilizing here a little bit. The injury situation has gotten better. It's still not good, but it is better. Benedict Mathurin has come back. A couple of guys have come back, and they're playing more competitively and got their second win of the season on Wednesday. But, yeah, far cry from where we were talking back in April, May, and June, and unfortunately, injuries are just the massive storyline for the Pacers, and I know we'll probably talk Fever at some point here as well. It was kind of the story of the Fever season as well, and it's the story that you least want to talk about because it's the one that really is the uncontrollable, and nobody wants to see any team stars go down, whether it's your own team or anybody else's.
That's so true, Pat. You don't want to see any stars go down. And the second part of our conversation today on the deep dive, we're going to talk about Steve Kerr's recent suggestions and observations about some possible avenues on how to fix this rash of injuries that are continuing to happen to star players and to players across the spectrum. But sticking with the Pacers, you lose Miles Turner. How much of a shock was that to you, Pat?
On a 1 to 10, I would give it maybe an 8 or a 9. It was pretty shocking. things. Miles had a pretty interesting 10 years in Indiana. I think you could write a pretty interesting book on his time here. The Pacers correctly identified him in the draft as somebody that should have been drafted much higher than he was. I think if you redraft that 2015 draft class, Turner probably goes something like 4th or 5th instead of where the Pacers got him, and which was off the top of my head, I think 12th or around there. And he had a great first couple of seasons. The Paul George trade happened. He kind of played second fiddle at the center position to Domantas Sabonis for a few years, was out of position, frankly had a couple of down years in large part, I think, because of that. Tyrese Halliburton came in, Rick Carlisle came in and kind of changed his world. They put him in position to succeed. He did succeed. And, really has embraced Indiana the whole way. And so I was surprised. The reason I won't give it a 10 is because when the Tyrese Halliburton injury happened, I remember sitting there in Oklahoma City on our radio row, and I remember thinking, not only, you go through something like that almost in waves, like a loss you might, and my first thought was, what does it mean for this game and the championship potential? But then my second thought was, what does this mean for next year? What does this mean for the next 5 years? And all of a sudden, the plan in place had the potential to alter. And so going, deep into the luxury tax when you don't have your best player doesn't always seem like the most fiscally responsible move. So I can't say I was 10 out of 10 shocked, but I was 8 or 9 out of 10 shocked because I thought, frankly, what Milwaukee did was shocking, too, to free up that space with Damian Lillard and to make that move. And, it's been a tough loss for the Pacers because they don't have that immediate starting center right now. But at the same time, Miles provided 10, I think, really good years in Indiana. Frustrating to see him leave. In my opinion, frustrating to see how he's handled some of that exit. But at the same time, when you're a free agent, you're allowed to do whatever you want to do, and we'll see how his time goes in Milwaukee. I think it's a risky move for him because everything hinges on what Giannis wants to do. And right now they're sitting, I think, here at 8-8, which seems like they're, right on the edge of things going really well or really poorly. But there's no question that the Pacers missed his on-floor ability, and there's no question that in the next, year or so, one of the top items that you have to figure out from a front office perspective is how to replace him or shore up the center position a little bit.
I'm talking with Pat Boylan. He is the voice of the Indiana Pacers and the Indiana Fever here on Hoop City with Paul Sir. Pat, one final thought on the Pacers. What are the bright spots? Because now Matherin's back, like you mentioned, the other Canadian on your team was injured. Now he's come back and he's playing with a bit of a vengeance right now. His numbers are very impressive. Pascal, when he has been healthy most of the year, has been very good. I think he's averaging 23 and change. Having Ryan back, are you more hopeful that the Pacers can, like you said, they're playing in a more competitive way? Are they starting to figure things out a little bit better so that they can be in more games and win some of the games that they should win?
Yeah, I think so. And, it's not my job to tell anybody in your listening audience who to root for, but I will make the point that you were sort of making there, which is if you're in search of an NBA team and you're a Canadian, the Pacers are a pretty good pick. I mean, you've got Andrew Nembhard, who's Canadian, you've got Benedict Mathurin, who's Canadian, and I know Pascal Siakam with his time in Toronto kind of feels like an adopted Canadian, and those are the three best players on the Pacers right now with Tyrese Halliburton hurt. So it's kind of been our 2.5 Canadian grouping that's been trying to get the Pacers through this. And Siakam has been healthy in that stretch, but Nembhard has not and Mathurin has not. But right now the trio is. And I think it's one of those cases where the Pacers were deep enough and had enough talent, in my opinion, to lose Tyrese Halliburton, but still win, I think, 44 to 47 games was realistic if health was on their side. It hasn't been even close to on their side. And so they're not, sniffing that number, at least on pace to do that right now. because it's not just that grouping that's been out. I mean, their depth has been decimated. They've been starting two-way guys, and they've been playing guys that weren't even in training camp, that were not even on a roster, like Jeremiah Robinson-Earl, who's done an admirable job, by the way. But in an ideal situation, Quentin Jackson and Jeremiah Robinson-Earl and Ray J. Dennis are not playing significant minutes for you, but they were earlier in the season. Now, that has changed some with Mathurin getting back, with Nembhard getting back, and with Siakam, you've got a really solid trio there. Maybe not a title-contending trio, but you've got a solid trio there. They're just really still struggling from a depth perspective. They played last night in Cleveland, and I think this is the best example. If you look at the backcourt that Cleveland trots out there, Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell, you're talking about two all-stars. The Pacers' backcourt of Nembhard and Mathurin combined to outscore that duo by a point. It was 53-52. Now, in a previous iteration of the Pacers, if your backcourt slightly outscores that Cleveland backcourt, you're feeling pretty darn good because top to bottom, you've got a deep team, and if you can match what their backcourt is doing, that might be the best backcourt in the NBA. Well, Siakam was good, but the Pacers didn't really have anybody step up beyond those top three, and that's, I think, the challenge right now. But if you look at when Benedict Mathurin came back, they played 3 games, so still small sample size. First half, he got into some foul trouble, barely played in Detroit of game number 1. But in the second half of Detroit, the Pacers outscored the Pistons, and in large part because Mathurin was fantastic. Next game, they win against Charlotte. Mathurin, very good. And last night, they hung around with Cleveland. It's a results-driven league, so I don't want to sit here and play the moral victory game, but the way things have been so down bad here the last month or so, hanging with Cleveland in Cleveland, Mathurin plays well. I think all encouraging signs. So the biggest but is, can they stay healthy? And they're not healthy, but can they stay the version of healthy they are? Because they can ill afford an injury, another one to any of those 3 guys. But if they can keep those 3 together, Aaron Nesmith is probably 3-ish weeks away. Obi Toppin is still long-term, and Tyrese Halliburton is out for the season. But you have the makings of, I think, what you were hoping for at the beginning of the season, which is still to be competitive. The major asterisk there is you're 2-14. So you've dug yourself in a massive, massive hole, and I don't know exactly how realistic it is that a group without Tyrese Halliburton can dig its way all the way out of that. But at the same time, I've learned the last couple of years with the Pacers not to put ceilings on what they're capable of, because if you would have done that, you would have not said they could go to the NBA Finals Game 7. You would have, the year before, not said they could have gone to the Eastern Conference Finals. So we'll see. It still is very early, but the hole that they have dug themselves in is considerable.
It is considerable, and I think about just the whole challenge that NBA franchises have with injured players. Like you look at Boston's situation. I mean, when you think of 2 years ago, that very good series between Boston and Indiana, when Indiana had a chance in a couple of games to actually beat the Celtics and take a sizable lead in that series, where Boston ultimately went on to win the championship. Last year, Tatum also goes out with a ruptured Achilles. Then, of course, what happened to Tyrese. The decimation of injuries to a key player, Milwaukee right now, they had a great start largely because Antetokounmpo was playing at an unbelievable level. Now he's out. Now they're coming back down to earth, of course. But injuries really are a topic of discussion that is far and wide across the NBA. And let's cross over to the WNBA, because injury to Caitlin Clark, that's Tyrese Halliburton-esque in terms of impact on a franchise. You're talking about the face of the WNBA, the heavy-duty leader of the Indiana Fever. She goes out, and what's interesting about it, Pat, that strikes me is up until this past year, Caitlin was pretty much an injury-free player. Now, she's getting older. She's playing in a professional league, not a college league. All the different factors that you can take into it. But were the Fever correct in shutting her down last year and not trying to force her to come back into the lineup? Because in spite of Caitlin being out, the Fever actually had, I think, a season that for a lot of people was better than expected.
No question. I actually think there are some parallels to the universe where the Pacers stay healthy minus the Tyrese Halliburton injury this year, which we were talking about earlier did not happen. But if the Pacers had only lost Tyrese Halliburton and most of the rest of that core stayed reasonably healthy the rest of the way, I think you might have seen a similar type Pacers season that you saw with the Fever with Caitlin Clark going down. Now, they suffered numerous – it wasn't just Caitlin. They suffered numerous other injuries and were playing that – I mean, I've said the word hardship exception more in the last 5 months than I have in the previous 11 years of my career here at Pacers Sports and Entertainment. I mean, it's becoming almost exhausting to talk about. But, that's the type of season I was hoping for the Pacers. They just got totally decimated by injury. To answer your question, yes, Caitlin Clark is – everything about the future of this franchise. That's not to say she's the only thing. There's, of course, many reasons to be optimistic, and there are numerous stars on this roster, including Aaliyah Boston and Kelsey Mitchell, who were brilliant, who were both totally available for the entirety of the season, and massive that those two stayed healthy and were able to carry the Fever to what they are able to. But this franchise, its future, is absolutely Caitlin Clark-centric. And so you have to think bigger picture. And I know I'm going to sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but I think you'll understand the distinction here. The Tyrese Halliburton injury that he suffered in Game 7, of course, it rose red flags, among the training staff. Whenever you have a calf injury like he suffered in Game 5, you always worry about the Achilles happening. In a scenario where the Pacers are not fighting for an NBA championship, where they're not going into Game 7, a scenario where you win that game, and you win an NBA championship, there's no chance Tyrese Halliburton is playing. But when that's on the line, you have to play. I mean, what else are you going – what's the point of even of suiting up if you're not going to play in a game like that, even with the injury risk that was there? So there should be no second-guessing about the Tyrese Halliburton injury. But at the same time, with Caitlin Clark, that scenario – is not apples to apples. And the last thing you wanted to happen with her is to suffer an injury by coming back too quickly that then takes you out of next year as well, which unfortunately is the situation with the Pacers. So I think it was handled absolutely the correct way. Frustrating in the moment for sure. Admirable to watch, that group be in overtime away from going to the WNBA Finals. I mean, both of the stories just kind of make me laugh as I say them because they're so improbable. The Pacers being a 4 seed and going to Game 7, the Fever having all these players out, not just Caitlin Clark, but Sophie Cunningham and Sydney Colson and Ari McDonald. I mean, they suffered big-time injury as well, and we're right on the doorstep of the WNBA Finals. And so, I think it's a franchise that has to keep the bigger picture in mind, and it was a really inspiring year. But at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to reach your ceiling as a team with Caitlin Clark not available, in the same way that you're not going to be able to reach your ceiling as a team with Tyrese Halliburton not available. So the long-term health of those two is paramount, and the only scenario where you push it is if you're in Game 7 of the NBA Finals and the Pacers got an unfortunate, horrible break in that regard. But no second-guessing that decision, and I think no second-guessing the decision to shut Caitlin Clark down because the two situations are quite different, in my opinion.
I'm talking with Pat Boylan, the play-by-play voice of the Indiana Pacers and the Indiana Fever, here on Hoop City with Paul Sir. We're going to take a real quick break right now, and we're going to come back with Pat on the deep dive. We'll talk a little bit more about Caitlin and the Fever, and we're also going to dive into Steve Kerr's comments on how the NBA has to address the rash of injuries that are taking place. Stay with us. Pat Boylan, the voice of the Indiana Fever and the Indiana Pacers. Pat, just finishing up with Caitlin. The read last year was there was an extraordinary amount of physical, some would call it dirty play, inflicted upon Caitlin that was not necessarily officiated at the level, certainly, that Indiana Fever fans would have liked, but even lacked support from the league that really called certain attitudes within the WNBA into question. Now, I'm not saying that's why Caitlin was out for the season. I don't want to make that claim, although certainly behind closed doors I might say something different. But Do you think there was something to the fact that the extreme physical play impacted Caitlin's ability to stay healthy?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I tend to lean no on that, but I'm not going to shut the door on the concept just because I don't know. I'm not in the training room. I don't know exactly, what led to the injuries that she was dealing with. The play that she got hurt on in Connecticut that ultimately, ended her season was non-contact. So I think it would be irresponsible to ignore it. But I think maybe a little bit of a reach to adamantly, profess that's why she got hurt. Sometimes injuries just happen. As you noted, she's been very healthy throughout her career, albeit it's different when you're talking about high school and college and the rigor and the grind of the WNBA. The bigger picture on that to me is, listen, I think there's almost a couple avenues on this. One of them is, I do think there needs to be an understanding that the WNBA can be physical at times. And when the NBA is physical at times, people aren't calling it out for being physical. And so sometimes I think there's a little bit of a double standard there. But more importantly, I think from a league-wide perspective, the NBA went through this in the 90s and the early 2000s where they looked at the game and they said, our stars are not able because of the way the game is played and officiated, our stars are not able to maximize their talents. And so there was kind of, the hand check was disallowed, for example. And if you go back and watch some of those 90s and early 2000s games, it almost feels like a different sport from what you're watching now. And I think the WNBA would benefit from a little tweaking in that regard. On one hand, I don't want to say that players can't be physical because physicality is a part of the game. But I think at the end of the day, people want to see stars and the top talent in the men's world and in the women's world be able to showcase that talent. And I do think, I don't know if there's a major shift that needs to happen, but I do think from a freedom of movement perspective, there are at minimum tweaks and adjustments that need to be made. As it relates to, how Caitlin Clark is officiated, I think that my motto on this has always been that professional basketball is the toughest sport in the world to officiate. And it's so easy for people to watch 5 replays on super slow-mo and then on the 5th one yell, oh, that's a foul, and they missed it when officials get one angle at one speed. That said, my motto on this has always been, from an officiating standpoint, you have to make your layups if you're the WNBA. You just have to, as it relates to this. And there was a scenario earlier last season, I should say, against Connecticut, where Marina Mabry, body checked her to the floor. Now, in the NBA, that is an unquestioned ejection immediately. And the WNBA rule is no different. And that was like mid-June, I think. I still remain flummoxed how 3 professional officials saw that happen, went to the monitor, watched it happen, and then came away with anything but an ejection. Of course, the league after the fact said it should have been an ejection. But in the moment, if your officials can't get that right, then that's a problem. So league-wide, I think there's an adjustment that could be made with freedom of movement, which would help the product, which I think is very, very good, by the way, but I think would make it even better. As it relates to Caitlin Clark and the officiating in the league, I think I tend to fall on the side of a little bit of an official apologist because I see how fast the game is. I know how difficult it is to officiate, but the you have to make your layups theme always comes back in this case. And for a situation like what happened in that Connecticut game, for her to get bodied to the floor and then for it not to be an ejection, that's a layup. And that was a missed layup. And those are the things that really cannot happen, in my opinion.
Well, and I think it fueled the conspiracy theory fire that the officials were out.
No question.
Yeah, and you're right. That was a bad miss. That was a bad miss. That's a layup for them to make that call. Correct. And just show that they're not biased, because the appearance was there was a bias in the wrong direction in that particular moment in time. But it's an interesting segue into something I wanted to get your feedback on, Pat, and that is Steve Kerr's comments this past week about the league making adjustments, and by the league I mean the NBA in this case, making some adjustments to start addressing the alarming number of injuries happening, not just to star players, which are happening at a rate, but also league-wide. And you just were talking about some of the injuries that the Indiana Pacers are fighting their way through. It's interesting that you mentioned the 90s and the 2000s, because when you think of Bill Laimbeer clotheslining Michael Jordan and Larry Bird and the physical play in the 80s and 90s, you are so correct when you talk about this being a completely different sport. It is a completely different sport now. And a lot of the physical play that took place at those times have been ruled out, if I can use that term, or officiated out of the way the game is played now. However, Kerr makes a compelling point about the pace of play, the amount of running that a player has to do now because of the explosion into three-point shooting and the style of play. And I've got a couple of suggestions that will never happen in terms of how to address this, but I think, what are your thoughts, Pat, about some of the comments that Steve Kerr made? Like, number one, we know that the NBA is not going to reduce the number of games. That ain't going to happen. But what about back-to-backs? What about some of the other suggestions that Kerr made?
Yeah, it's a heavy topic. There's a lot to talk about with it. I always begin a discussion like this with the disclaimer of I am not a doctor, nor do I even try to play one on radio or TV. So anything that I say here,
I can't call you Dr. Pat now.
Please don't. My high school GPA will confirm that I should not be called Dr. Pat. But you watch a lot of basketball. I watch a lot of basketball. And frankly, you go back and watch. I mean, I'm thinking of this because it was just on my mind because of Lenny Wilkens, rest in peace, his passing. NBA TV in the U.S. was playing I think it was the 1979 Game 5 where Lenny Wilkens Sonics won the NBA championship. Now, we're talking a long time ago in 79, but it's startling how different of a game it was. And even so true watching, I mean, listen, anybody here in Indianapolis or Indiana grew up like me on 90s Pacers. It was basketball heaven in the 90s and the early 2000s. And yet you go back and watch some of those. You watch the 2000 finals against the Lakers, and don't get me wrong. I mean, Reggie and Kobe and Shaq, the star power was fantastic. The games were competitive. But at least for me, I think the product is a lot more enjoyable now. Now, you can make a case that in some areas the heavy three-point shooting has gone a little bit too far, but it's amazing, really, to watch 20 years ago and watch the NBA now, and it's wildly different. I think Kerr makes a ton of good points. I think the amount of area, for example, that a defender has to cover. You watch the 2000, it would have been the 2005, I think, conference finals between the Pacers and the Pistons. I mean, it's a lot of guy backs down in the lane and four guys are maybe not standing around, but like from a defender's perspective, what you're asked to do, the physical exertion on your body is just wildly different. So it makes a lot of sense to me. And we had a conversation, I think maybe back in late June or early July, after Tyrese Halliburton's injury. The other thing, and I don't know if this makes any medical sense, but the other thing that I think is potentially valid is each generation is more athletic than the last. But is each generation, the ligaments and all of that, is that growing equal with the athleticism? I mean, you look at these Achilles tears, and a lot of them happen in this similar situation where a player takes a step back and load bears on that lower portion of that leg, and that's where a lot of these Achilles tears are happening. Have the Achilles strengthened as generations have passed to keep up with the athleticism, the wild athleticism that you're seeing from today's athletes? I don't know that answer, but I think that also contributes to it. And, I will say when I started with the Pacers in 2014, 2015, the amount of back-to-backs we have now is significantly down. I think you can still continue to try to cut them down, but part of the dispiriting thing to me is it's like the league has way less back-to-back now than it did 10 years ago, and it's a bigger problem now than it was 10 years ago. And I don't know what the answer to that is, because I don't want to diminish the product as a result to keep players healthy, but But you're right. I mean, way too many star players are out right now, and that's especially concerning in a star-driven league like the NBA.
Well, and I think, Pat, a couple of comments, first of all, about the bygone eras. You know, I grew up, I am fortunate enough to be old enough to have watched Wilt play Russell. And and then through all of the generations since then. And, you know, of course you idealize what you watched in the day. But when I watch Larry Bird and the Celtics square off against Magic and the Lakers, I mean, there was magic in those moments because you didn't know any better. But when you watch it now and you watch how they play defense and you watch the spacing on offense, I mean, you've got Robert Parrish, Kevin McHale, Larry Bird, all monstrous people. And they were all playing below the free throw line. Like the spacing differences were just totally different. And you're absolutely right. You cannot deny the athleticism 1 through 14 on any NBA roster right now. And the pace of play, all about it is the game has improved in many, many respects. They've taken a lot of the physical play out. The injuries, I think there is a lot of wear and tear here. We were talking, Josh, my producer, and I were talking before about the kids playing AAU from when they're 10 years old and being told that they got to play 12 months out of the year. It all contributes. It all goes into the injury stew and has to be dealt with. I'm going to give you my radical idea on one thing that could be done that would help tremendously in terms of the space that you'd have to cover is take away one of the rules that I loathe the most in the NBA, and that is defensive 3 seconds. I despise that rule. That, to me, I understand the reasoning behind it and all of that. But, my gosh, if you could put Rudy Gobert in the center where he belongs and was plugging up the lane, the NBA would have to adapt. Players would have to cover less space, and things would be very, very different at that point. Now, that's me being a hack and just coming up with a real simplistic attitude. I believe in what I'm saying, though. I wish they would get rid of the defensive 3 seconds. But, you know, there are things that they would have to do, but there are things that you really can't adapt to, and that players are so much more athletic, and whether bones, muscles, and tendons have kept up with this increased athleticism, speed of play, and rigorous schedule, it's really hard to come up with a definitive answer.
You referred to it as a stew, and I think that's really the best way to think of this, is it's not one thing, right? It's 5 or 6 different ingredients that are mixing here together. And, you know, the idea of defensive 3 seconds is interesting. The NBA, I don't want to say it's in a crisis spot because the NBA is still wildly popular and you know, in a major growth phase, but it is a red flag. So in my opinion, you know, in this topic, we're in the no bad ideas land because any idea to help improve this should be taken seriously. I had never considered the one that you brought up. It's interesting. It certainly is, you know, and part of defensive 3 seconds too is part of that bygone era of, you know, to keep Shaquille O'Neal and to keep Charles Barkley from just hanging out in the paint, and that wasn't the most interesting basketball. Some of that's offensive 3 seconds as well. But it's an interesting thought. It's an interesting concept. You know, it's one of those things where this is where the G League is potentially quite helpful because they can guinea pig rules with the G League. They do that all the time. They use it in the WNBA too. I mean, the 14-second reset on the shot clock on an offensive rebound, they tried that in the WNBA, and the first time I saw it, I was like, why have we not been doing this for 50 years? You know, there's no reason a team needs 24 full seconds when they get an offensive rebound and they're already at their end of the floor. So, you know, this is where the G League's valuable, to guinea pig ideas like this, because it is a problem. It's not a death knell for the league by any stretch of the imagination, but you just hate to see scenarios where, you know, Boston is eliminated from the playoffs because Jason Tatum tears his Achilles, and then 4 weeks later, the Pacers are eliminated from the playoffs because Tyrese Halliburton tears his Achilles. I mean, you want these games decided by the best players on the floor, and unfortunately, we did not have that in the 2025 playoffs, and frankly, the Pacers benefited from it a little bit too. Darius Garland was available for only 3 of the 5 games and not 100% in that Cavs series either. So, you know, it adds a dimension of uncontrollable and a dimension of luck to the equation, which maybe can allow unexpected outcomes, which, that's good for the NBA. The NBA shouldn't be too predictable, but that should not be coming because of injuries and because of star players being out. And I wish I had better ideas. It sounds like Adam Silver is investing in some, real high-level technology. Sounds like a good idea to me, although I have no idea what that entails. But any and all ideas are good ideas, or at least ones that should be considered in my book.
Well, Pat, you've been extremely generous with your time today. Thank you so much for spending your time with us on the Deep Dive on Hoop City with Paul Sir. I really look forward to our next conversation, and I hope the Pacers are able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, start winning some games, and be rewarded for all the great things that this organization has done. And, of course, the same goes with the Indiana Fever. And all the best to you, Pat. Thanks again for your time.
I appreciate that. And we have chatted certainly during some of the very highest of highs and the lowest of lows over the last 5 or 6 months in the Pacers organization. So it's been an interesting time to chat with you. But I enjoyed the time as well and looking forward to our next visit.